Tonight, we journey beyond the polished roads of Rome, into the dark, dense forests and wind-swept plains where the so-called barbarians once thrived. But were they truly barbaric or simply misunderstood by the quills of those who feared them? From the thunder of Gothic hooves to the fierce pride of the Celts, from tribal councils by firelight to the sacred oaths of Germanic warriors, this is not the story written in Roman glory, but whispered in the shadows they feared. What was life really like for the people Rome called the Other? What did they wear to bed? What scared them when night fell? And what quiet dreams carried them across centuries into our restless memory? Let's lie back, breathe deep, and drift into a forgotten world of warriors, wanderers, and wild wisdom. Before we step into the untamed history of the so-called barbarians, don't forget to tap the bell icon, subscribe, and like this video to support more sleepy stories of ancient whispers and distant dreams. A comment below, which lost people or vanished tribe should we explore next? Your idea could become our next bedtime tale. You are standing on a slope that will one day be called Ukraine, though no map has yet bothered to name it. The year is 220 AD by the daylight calendar of the Romans, but here the only calendar is the height of feather grass and the weight of mare's milk. You watch a boy bundle tinder while his mother combs the undercoat from a chestnut horse. The hair will be spun into bowstrings. The tinder will light tonight's fire that keeps wolves from the folds. Nothing about the scene feels historic. The wind smells of iron and sour milk, exactly as it did last century and will next. Yet the thin, almost invisible footpaths widening behind this family are the first stitches in a tapestry that will one day drape itself across the Rhine, the Danube, the Forum, and finally, the marble steps of the capital itself. The people you are watching do not call themselves Goths. They do not call themselves anything louder than the wind. Their own word, if you could catch it, sounds like gut things, a soft click at the back of the throat, meaning simply the people who own this bend of river. They live in wagons whose wheels never stop creaking because the axles are greased with a mixture of butter and pine, resin that softens in summer and stiffens in frost. Each wagon is 3 meters long, built of larch planks steamed and bent into hoops, then covered with felt the color of dry steppe. Inside, the air is permanently thick with the sweet reek of churned mare's milk and the sharper tang of smoked cheese. You would think such a small space could hold no secrets, yet every family keeps a locked birch bark box under the sleeping felt. In the box lies a curled scrap of silver foil, no wider than a thumb, a Roman denarius, clipped and hammered into the shape of a tiny moon. It is not money here. It is a charm against thunder, inherited from a grandmother who once swapped 2 wolf pelts for it beside the Dniester. The coin's original emperor has been worn smooth, so the profile now looks like a generic ancestor, mouth open mid-sentence, forever warning. Night comes quietly. There is no dramatic sunset, only a gradual draining of color until the grass and the sky are the same shade of ash. Someone begins to pluck a horsehead fiddle, but the tune is so slow you cannot tell whether it is music or simply the wind finding another gap in the felt. The oldest man, whose cheek carries the pale scar of a wolf's tooth, tells the children that tomorrow they will move the herd 3 days north to new pasture. He does not explain why. The grass here still reaches the knee, but he has noticed that the dung beetles are flying lower, and the cranes passed overhead in loose, silent strings instead of the usual bold chevrons. These details matter more than any written omen. You might wonder why Rome, 500 leagues away, should ever fear people who measure wealth in hooves and butter. The answer lies in the unseen ledger the herdsmen keep with the wind. Every generation the wind shifts, the rainfall slips south, and the pasture grows thinner. When that happens, the herds press against their neighbors, who press against theirs until the ripple reaches the great river guarded by Roman forts. The guards on the far bank write nervous reports about Scythian wanderers and send them to a governor who files them in a chest that will not be opened until the wax has already cracked. By then the Nanhai you watched bundling tinder will have become a father, then perhaps a grandfather, and the paths behind his wagon will have widened into ruts deep enough to snap a leg. History sometimes begins as nothing more impressive than a shallow groove in turf, repeated often enough that even the grass gives up trying to erase it. Before you drift to sleep, consider this. The people you have just met do not yet know they are going to be called Goths. They do not know that their grandchildren will one day stand inside stone walls arguing about the price of bread, or that their great-grandchildren will sew blue embroidery into cloaks and claim it is the night sky of their lost homeland. They only know the smell of the next mornings and the promise that if they keep moving, the earth will provide. Yet the moment you looked at them, you became the first witness to a story that will outrun empires. The question is not whether they will move again, but what tiny, boring decision, which foal to leave unshod, which grandmother's box to leave unburied, will tilt the balance when the wind next changes direction. 70 summers after the night you stood on the slope, the same wagon line, now 300 souls heavier, waits on the eastern bank of the Dniester. The river is neither wide nor fierce. Its deepest channel barely reaches a man's waist in late August. Yet everyone delays because the horses are tired and the felt is soaked from a week of fine, persistent rain that tastes of smoke. The oldest woman, who was the girl combing chestnut horsehair in the first scene, unwraps her thunder-charmed silver. The coin has developed a green vein across the emperor's nose, as if he has been breathing river air too long. She does not consult the men. She simply presses the foil against the tongue of a 7-year-old colt, feels its warmth, and decides the omens are good. At dawn, the herd enters the water in a slow brown braid, foals swimming beside their mothers, dogs perched on wagon roofs like pessimistic philosophers. On the opposite bank, they enter the world of Rome, though no eagles or Li Chengbei announce the fact. The grass is the same, but the dung of Roman patrol horses lies scattered in regular pellets that smell of oats instead of steppe sage. A detachment of 20 auxiliaries watches from a wooden watchtower whose logs still ooze resin. The Romans have been ordered not to harass migrants, only to count them and collect a per-head tribute in dried meat. The transaction is so routine that the officer writes various Scythians 327 paid in beef without even asking the name of the clan. He does not notice that among the herds walk adolescent boys carrying short reflex bows wrapped in waxed linen, or that the felt wagons are now stacked higher than usual, carrying rolled willow mats that could be sold or used to ford deeper rivers. You travel with them another season. The pace is not dramatic, 10, perhaps 12 Roman miles a day, set by the weakest cow. At every 5th mile, the women stop to air the cheese, turning the blackened patties so the crusts dry evenly. Children walk backwards alongside the wagons, practicing the throaty gutturals of their future war cries without knowing it. They think they are only imitating the cough of stallions. When evening comes, they camp within earshot of Roman roads, but never on them, obeying an unspoken rule that the dirt belongs to whoever can write on it last. Night after night you listen to the same small disputes. Who left the butter sack to? Close to the embers, whose turn to braid the tail of the shaggy grey that keeps kicking the dogs. None of it feels like the forging of a nation. Yet beneath the tedium the ledger of displacement grows. Every river crossed adds one more layer of vocabulary. The Dniester word for current is replaced by the Prut word, then the Siret, then the toother. Each time the tongue shifts a little further from the old steppe sing-song toward the harsher consonants of the forests ahead. Every marketplace they pass adds a new iron tool, a small axe head traded for wolf skins, a Roman sickle exchanged for butter. The metal is never discarded. It is reforged into horseshoes, then into belt buckles, then into the decorative plates that will one day adorn sword scabbards. You can almost hear the future clanking in the bottom of every wagon, but the sound is muffled by sacks of millet and the perpetual rustle of grazing. One autumn they reach the base of the Carpathians, where the plains buckle into fog and oak. Here the caravan stops longer than usual because the mares are heavy with foal, and the men have begun to suffer from a cough that tastes of rust. A Roman market town called Tiras huddles on a limestone bluff, its amphorae stacked like dark beehives. For the first time you see the herdsman bargain in writing. A Greek scribe, stylus behind his ear, scratches their names onto a wax tablet. Not their real names, but approximations the tax collector can pronounce. The leader is recorded as Pholkos, though his mother calls him Little Wind. The scribe adds a note, willing to guide troops through pass for barley ration. The words are ordinary, yet they mark the instant in which the unnamed bend of river people become auxiliaries of Rome, entitled to carry spears and draw rations, obligated to fight whomever Rome points at. The boy who once bundled tinder is now the grandfather leaning on that spear, wondering if the bargain will make his grandchildren safer or merely hungrier in a different way. Winter in the foothills is the deepest boredom you have ever tasted. Snow arrives not as a storm, but as a slow leak from the sky, day after day, until the wagons are half buried and the horses must be dug out each dawn. Firewood is scarce. They burn horse-dung cakes that smoulder with a blue flame and smell of fermented hay. Conversation shrinks to the minimum syllables needed to keep the fire alive. Someone repairs a crack in a felt wall using boiled nettle fiber. The job takes 4 days and ends with no ceremony beyond a nod. Yet during those 4 days, the idea of home mutates. The wagons no longer face the sunrise as they did on the steppe. They are angled to block the mountain wind, forming a shallow horseshoe that looks remarkably like a fortified Roman lager. Without anyone deciding, the circle tightens each night, until the space inside is too small for the herd, and the animals must sleep outside the barrier. Protection has begun to outweigh tradition. When spring finally leaks through the snow, the clan moves again, but the direction has shifted subtly westward, following the course of the Danube's upper tributaries. They pass through Dacian villages, abandoned since Trajan's wars. Ivy has crept over the stone thresholds, but the wooden doorposts still bear Latin tally marks recording grain taxes. The herdsmen camp in the roofless courtyards, grateful for walls that block the wind. Children play at grinding the leftover millet in Roman pestles. Women use broken milestone fragments as anvils to straighten bent nails. Every object is reused. Nothing is wasted, and yet every reuse is a quiet act of archaeology. The past being folded into the future one nail at a time. You might expect some grand council to announce the moment when wanderers become invaders, but the only assembly is the nightly distribution of milk. The headman's wife ladles portions into wooden bowls while recounting, for the 100th time, how her own grandmother once saw eagles perched on a dead oak. The story never changes, yet tonight the listeners imagine the eagles not as omens of death, but as scouts mapping the road ahead. When the bowls are empty, the younger men stay by the embers longer than usual, talking about the price of iron in the markets downriver. One of them idly twists a wolf vertebra on a leather thong. He has been carrying the bones since the Carpathians, planing it each evening into a rough bead. Without deciding, he strings it beside 2 Roman copper coins he punched into crude discs. The necklace is ugly, asymmetrical, and utterly unremarkable. Until you realize it is the first regimental insignia these people have ever invented. The question that lingers as sleep approaches is not whether they will cross the great river that Rome calls the Danube. They have already crossed a dozen lesser rivers without ceremony. The question is whether, when they finally do, anyone on the far bank will recognize that the muddy footprints in the reed banks are the same grooves first pressed into Ukrainian turf 3 generations earlier. Will the Roman clerks file them under a new name, or will the old name, the soft click of gut things, survive long enough to be misspelled by a Greek secretary into Gothoi? The answer matters less than the fact that, somewhere, between the Carpathian snow and the Danube mist, the people you have been following stopped being mere migrants and became the hinge on which an empire will squeal. The crossing finally happens on a morning so grey that river and sky share the same pewter skin. There is no trumpet, no shouted order, only the creak of wagons easing down a mud ramp fortified with saplings and braided willow. The herd enters the Danube thigh-deep, sounding like rain on a tin roof. Roman auxiliaries stand on the western bank counting under their breath. They have seen this spectacle every spring, yet today the numbers feel heavier. Perhaps it is the absence of children's chatter. The young ones have been told to keep silent, and the silence itself becomes a kind of speech. By midday the last wagon is across, and the felt line spreads on the flat floodplain like a dark stain that refuses to soak in. Within a week they have camped beside a ruined sentry post whose Latin inscription, Cohors tu Gallorum, stone replaced AD 178, has already half sunk into the earth. The stone is repurposed as a chopping block. The bronze eagle that once topped the plaque now weighs down a tent flap. No one remarks on the symbolism. Instead, the daily boredom reasserts itself. Mares must be milked, dung must be dried, cheese must be turned. Yet the grass here is different. Softer, lusher, impregnated with seeds that stick to wool and skin. For the first time in living memory, the herds do not need to move every few days. The wagons form their habitual horseshoe, but the open end faces not the wind and not the sunrise, but the southwest road that leads toward the Roman provincial town of Viminatium. The circle stays closed for 3 whole weeks, an eternity. During the 3rd week, a Roman supply train arrives under escort. The officer in charge is a Thracian named Glykon who speaks Gothic haltingly, having learned it from border hostages. He carries a wax tablet listing the clan as friendly laity, settlers entitled to land in exchange for army service. The land measure is astonishingly precise: eugerum per horse, half eugerum per cow, nothing for dogs or children. Glykon the stylus scratches like a mouse while clerks pace out the dimensions with a knotted rope. When the survey is complete, the headman, still called Folkos, although his beard is now the color of dirty snow, receives a wooden tessera stamped with the imperial portrait. The token grants him the right to draw seed grain from the military granary, but it also obligates him to deliver 1 fully equipped rider for every 4 eugera. The bargain is struck without drama. Folkos merely presses his thumb into the soft wax beside the seal. That night the wagons do not circle. They are arranged instead in straight streets between newly pegged boundary stones. The felt walls are lifted off the hoops and draped over ridgepoles, forming long roofs that look oddly like the barracks Glykon's men occupy. Children race along the muddy alleyways, delighted by the novelty. Old women sit at the thresholds, spinning horsehair and watching the sky as they always have. Yet the sky itself seems confused. The stars no longer rise over the open steppe, but are framed by the silhouettes of Roman watchtowers. You stay through the first harvest. The seed grain issued by the quartermaster is emmer, a tough, husked wheat the Goths have never grown. They plant it in the Roman manner, with a light plough borrowed from a veteran who stayed behind after the Marcomannic Wars. The work is excruciatingly dull, bent backs, monosyllables, the same 12 paces from furrow to furrow. When the shoots appear, they are thin and grey-green, nothing like the lush steppe grass. But the soil is generous, and by midsummer the field ripples with a gold that seems almost Roman. On threshing day, the entire settlement gathers to beat the stalks with flails made from old wagon spokes. The grain is winnowed in a mild breeze that smells of pine and distant resin. Chaff drifts like midsummer snow. For the first time, the community eats bread that did not come from trade, and the taste is so foreign that the children complain it sticks to their teeth. Autumn brings the census. Another clerk, this one from the provincial capital, arrives with inkpots and a scroll, whose length embarrasses the village scribe, a Greek slave who has been teaching letters to 2 bright boys in exchange for butter. The scroll lists names, ages, animals, tools, even the number of bronze buckles in each household. When the clerk reaches the necklace of wolf vertebra and copper coins, he pauses, puzzled. The wearer, now a lanky teenager named Wulfric, explains that it is for luck. The clerk records amulet, unofficial, and moves on. Nothing in his report hints that the ornament will be copied by hundreds of young riders up and down the limes, until the bone bead becomes as recognizable along the frontier as the Roman eagle itself. Winter is the quietest you have yet endured. Snow falls, melts, refreezes into a crust that supports the weight of crows but cracks under a hoof. Supplies arrive on schedule, jars of salted pork, bolts of coarse linen, a single crate of glassware that no one knows how to use. In January, the auxiliary commander requests 20 foals for cavalry remounts. They are led away with rope halters, neighing once before disappearing into the grey. The herd feels the loss like a missing tooth. The remaining animals bunch closer, as if proximity could prevent further subtraction. One March dawn you wake to find the settlement transformed. Overnight, someone has moved the milestone of Cohors 2 Galorum from the chopping block to the entrance of the new lane. It stands upright, its inscription scrubbed clean, crowned by a crude iron cross hammered from a broken ploughshare. No one admits to the deed, but everyone understands. The stone has ceased to be spoil and has become a marker of belonging. The milestones of Rome are being repurposed into the boundary stones of something unnamed. The season turns. Boys who were toddlers when the Danube was first crossed now ride small-step ponies bareback, practicing wheeling charges across the wheat stubble. Their laughter is identical to that of their grandfathers on the Ukrainian plain, yet their horses wear Roman snaffle bits and their belts end in buckles cast in the shape of dolphins. They speak Gothic at home, Latin in the fields, and a mongrel tongue when bartering at the garrison market. One afternoon, Wulfric, the wolf-bone boy, wins a foot race against the son of a Roman camp doctor and is awarded a cheap bronze whistle shaped like a boar. He hangs it next to his vertebra amulet, and the two objects knock together with a sound like dry seed pods. That night, he dreams of grass that never stops moving, and when he wakes, he cannot remember whether the dream was memory or prophecy. The year ends with an accounting. The settlement has produced 30 modii of wheat above the tax quota, 8 foals accepted for cavalry, 3 boys literate enough to copy supply lists, and, most surprising, 1 marriage between a Gothic girl and a retired Thracian archer. The archer wears his Roman citizenship like a second skin. The bride wears her grandmother's silver moon denarius sewn into her veil. At the wedding feast, Glycon returns, now promoted, and raises a cup of watered wine. He toasts to the limes of culture, a phrase no one understands, yet everyone applauds because applause is easier than translation. Long after the guests leave, you remain awake, listening to the stable clock of horses chewing, the occasional clink of Wulfric's whistle against bone. The settlement is no longer a migrant camp. It is a village with streets, accounts, and an uncertain future. The grass beneath your feet is stationary, bounded by stones and taxes. The people who once measured life by the horizon now measure it by the height of grain in a Roman modius.
You understand without anyone announcing it that the hinge has turned.
The Goths have not invaded Rome. They have slipped inside its ledger, one entry at a time. The question that follows you towards sleep is deceptively simple. When these children's children finally march south under banners of their own, will they be leaving home or returning to it? The milestones they carry will be Roman, the bread in their satchels will be Roman, even the coins in their purses will bear the profile of an emperor whose name they can barely pronounce. Yet the lullaby their mothers hum, a tune older than any border, will still contain the soft click of gut things, the wind across Ukrainian feather grass, and the smell of butter smoked into felt. History will call them barbarians, but the dullest truth is that they became what they ate, walked on, and counted. The grass has stopped moving. The people have not. Somewhere between the last sheaf of emmer and the first clink of bronze on bone, the story of Rome quietly became their story, and no one, not even the clerks with their endless scrolls, noticed the moment it happened. You were in a room that smells of damp parchment and heated resin. The year is 614, though no one here cares about the Anno Domini. They care whether the ink on the receipt will dry before the rain starts again. The room is above a granary in the small town of Varennes, halfway between the Loire and the Seine, a place too insignificant for kings, yet just large enough to support a permanent scribe. That scribe, a man named Leopold, hunches over a walnut table whose left leg is shorter than the right, compensated by a folded tax receipt from the previous reign. He is copying a royal command issued 3 months earlier by King Clothar II, a document whose polite Latin phrases translate roughly to count every chicken, weigh every bushel, and if the count is off by 1 egg, the shortfall will be extracted from your hide. Leopold's hand cramps. But the script must remain perfect, because imperfect script invalidates the document, and an invalid document invites auditors. Travelling men who carry small knives for sharpening quills and larger knives for encouraging honesty. You watch him rule margins with a dry twig, then dip the reed into oak gall ink, so acidic it has begun to eat through the parchment itself. Each stroke hisses faintly as the liquid corrodes flesh made from sheep gut. The room is otherwise silent, except for the granary steward downstairs, who inventories sacks of spelt by bouncing them on his knee and guessing the weight within a pound.
Accuracy here is not mathematical.
It is musical. The thud of a full sack versus the lighter flap of one that has been skimmed. Outside, the town performs its seasonal obedience. Peasants who cannot read queue before the granary door, presenting chickens whose legs have been tied with twine of 3 different colours. White for the church tithe, red for the royal land tax, blue for the local levy that funds the wooden bridge rotten since the time of Clothar's grandfather. The colours matter because the steward is quasi-literate. He records payment by knotting matching strings onto a willow rod, which will later be unravelled in front of Leopold, who will translate knots into numbers and numbers into ink. The system is impossibly fragile. A single shower could blur the dye. A single goat could nibble the rod. Yet it has functioned for 40 years because nobody questions fragility that still stands. You might ask why kingdoms rise or fall on such threadbare convenience. The answer is that Merovingian Gaul is less a kingdom than a family argument stretched across too many square miles. Clothar the Setter rules because his mother killed his cousin's uncles, and because the bishops, tired of blood, agreed that one king was cheaper than 5. But agreement is not control. South of here, Duke Boso ignores royal missives. North of here, Mayor Ado counts coins in the name of the late Queen Brunhild, whose severed head was paraded on a
spear so recently that the memory still smells of iron. The only thing
binding these fragments together is the certainty that whoever collects the taxes must forward a portion to whoever calls himself king this year. The receipt in Leopold's room is therefore a kind of prayer. If the numbers add up, God, or at least the auditor, will agree that the world still coheres. The day drags. Ink dries slowly in humid air, so Leopold resorts to a trick learned from his predecessor. He waves a smouldering reed torch beneath the parchment, letting carbon dust settle and absorb the excess acid. The process darkens the room, and in the half-light the hanging chickens outside look like guilty angels condemned to silence. A merchant from Orléans arrives with a barrel of salt fish so pungent the steward refuses to let it pass the threshold. Negotiations take place in the street, voices kept low because loud talking is taxed, as disturbance of customary peace. The merchant finally agrees to pay an extra goose in lieu of coin, and the goose, indignant, is promptly added to the white string tally. Its honk echoes off the granary wall like a protest no one understands. Evening brings the moment you have been waiting for without knowing it. Leopold finishes the last line, and in witness whereof we command this chirograph to be validated by the seal of Varennes, anno 14th of the most serene Lord Clothar. He reaches for a lump of green sealing wax, warms it over the torch, then pauses. The lump is insufficient. A second receipt must be sealed tomorrow, meaning another day of labor, another day of chickens and goose honks. In that pause, the entire illusion of bureaucratic inevitability hangs by a thread thinner than twine. Leopold could choose to stretch the wax, to imprint the seal shallow, to declare the job done. No one would notice until the auditor arrives, perhaps months away. And by then the harvest might fail, the king might die, the world might have shifted enough to make a flawed seal irrelevant. He hesitates so long the wax cools and must be rewarmed. During that second melting you sense the kingdom wobbling, not because anyone revolts, but because a clerk's cramp might produce a blur that future clerks copy as precedent. Night settles. The finished receipts are stacked beneath a limestone slab to keep mice from tasting the parchment. Leopold locks the door with a key so simple it could be carved by a child, then walks home through streets already empty of honest noise. He does not know that 300 miles away a frustrated noble named Godinus is preparing a petition that will cite irregularities in Varennes tallies as evidence of royal mismanagement. He does not know that the Queen's former steward, now hiding in a monastery, keeps a duplicate set of books whose numbers contradict his own by exactly 12 geese and 1/4 sack of rye. He only knows his wrist aches and that tomorrow's wax must suffice. Before sleep takes you, consider how empires totter, not always on battlefields, but in the moment when a clerk decides whether imperfect wax is better than no wax at all. The choice Leopold makes to reheat, to proceed, seems trivial, yet it sets in motion a succession of copies, each slightly more smudged, each accepted because the previous one was. By the time the auditors reach Varennes, the smudge will have become custom, and custom will have become law. The question drifting behind your eyelids is whether any kingdom can survive once its records are accurate enough to expose its contradictions, or inaccurate enough to hide them. 2 seasons have passed since Leopold warmed his wax. The king's auditor, a Burgundian named Sigiramnus, whose Latin is fluent but whose handwriting resembles bird tracks, arrives on the feast of Saint Mame, when tradition demands charity toward animals. Sigiramnus interprets this liberally. He accepts a lamb instead of the customary honey cake, then demands to see every receipt issued since the previous audit. The pile is larger than expected because Leopold, anxious to stay ahead, has been drafting documents in advance, dating them optimistically into the future. The result is a stack of parchment whose bottom layers are still damp with yesterday's ink. The audit begins in the granary loft, doors thrown open so that light pours across the receipts like judgment. Sigiramnus works methodically. He sniffs the ink, too vinegary means too fresh, holds pages to the sun, translucence reveals erasures, weighs the sealing wax, underweight seals suggest short measure revenue. Each discovery is entered into his own ledger, a codex bound in goat leather so new it still smells of hair. You notice that he writes on both sides of the parchment, a practice Leopold considers wasteful. When asked, Sigiramnus replies that the king's justice must be bilateral. The phrase is meaningless but sounds authoritative, so Leopold nods. Hour by hour the discrepancies accumulate. The white string tally lists 32 chickens paid to the church. The corresponding receipt records 30. The red string land tax shows 8 geese short. The blue string bridge levy is missing entirely because the steward spent the proceeds on planks that have not yet been nailed into place. None of the shortages are large, certainly not large enough to fund a rebellion, but their very pettiness offends the bureaucratic sense of order. Sigiramnus begins to suspect deliberate fraud rather than seasonal oversight, and fraud implies conspiracy, and conspiracy implies treason. The logic is as tight as the knot in a noose. To test his theory, he conducts a live experiment. He orders the steward to bring the remaining chickens, then personally recounts them in front of the village. The birds, alarmed by the strange man with bird-track handwriting, flutter and defecate so freely that the ground becomes a white speckled mess. The final tally is 34, 2 more than the white string count. Sigiramnus frowns. An excess is as suspicious as a deficit. He demands to know where the extra chickens came from. The steward explains that 2 hens have hatched clutches since the last audit, but chicks are not taxable until they crow. The explanation is reasonable, yet it introduces the concept of taxable versus non-taxable time, a distinction so slippery that Sigiramnus feels the solid earth tilt. He enters the surplus as latent revenue, subject to future assessment, thereby inventing a debt that does not yet exist, but someday must. Word of the auditor's rigor spreads faster than spring flood. Peasants who had planned to pay in grain hurry to convert it into chickens, which they hope will be counted more leniently. The market at Varennes floods with poultry. Prices collapse, and a single goose now trades for 3 modier of rye instead of 2. The ripple reaches the bishop at Autumn, whose estate depends on tithes calculated in rye. He writes to the king complaining that the faithful are impoverished by arithmetic. The king, preoccupied with a pregnant mistress and a war against Saxon pirates, forwards the letter to his treasurer, who files it under Varennes Minor. The file will not be opened, again until the chickens have become legend and the rye has rotted in. Granaries whose keys have been lost. In the loft, Sigiramnus completes his report. 12 pages of tightly wound Latin that conclude with a recommendation to rectify enumeration practices and impose
exemplary fines. The fines amount to 30 solidi,
roughly the value of an entire year's bridge levy, payable in gold or equivalent livestock. Leopold calculates that selling every remaining chicken will raise barely half the sum. The alternative is to borrow from the Jewish merchant of Orléans, who charges interest at 1 obol per solidus per month, compounded secretly because usury is condemned by both church and king. The debt, once contracted, will roll forward like a millstone, gathering future harvests into its path. The auditor departs on a morning when fog erases the road. taking with him the original receipts and leaving only copies whose ink is already flaking. Leopold stands in the doorway, watching the mule train disappear, feeling the way a farmer feels when the first hailstone strikes. The damage is invisible, but the sound is unmistakable. He returns to his loft, lights the dim torch, and begins drafting next year's receipts, adjusting numbers upward to cover the fines. The adjustments are small. 1 extra egg per hen, 1 unrecorded gosling. But they compound the earlier smudges into a deliberate blur. You stay long enough to see the first payment come due. The village sells its beehives, thereby losing the wax needed for future seals. Without wax, Leopold must buy inferior tallow that crumbles in summer heat. The seals break, allowing mice to nibble the parchment. Entries disappear, requiring reconstructions from memory, and memory, bored by repetition, invents convenient truths. By the following spring, the ledgers of Varennes exist in 2 versions, the official one sent to court, which shows steady revenue, and the private one kept under the limestone slab, which shows steady collapse. The gap between them is no longer measured in eggs or geese, but in hope. The section ends with a detail so petty it feels cosmic. Sigiramnus, conscientious to the end, sends a postscript demanding a sample of the new sealing wax to verify quality.
Leopold has none.
He melts down the green wax from his own household candlesticks, the last luxury his wife inherited from her mother. The impressed seal is imperfect, the colour slightly lighter than royal standard. Sigiramnus files the sample with a note. Wax substandard. Suggest investigation. The investigation will not occur for another 3 years, by which time the candlesticks will be gone, the wax will be gone, and the kingdom itself will be searching for someone to blame for a shortfall that began with 32 chickens and ended with empty beehives. The question you carry into sleep is whether any ledger can survive its own accuracy, or whether the act of recording debt eventually summons the very insolvency it fears. 7 years after the first imperfect seal, Varennes has changed so gradually that even its dogs fail to bark at difference. The bridge, finally repaired, carries traffic brisk enough to justify a toll booth, a wooden shed whose keeper records each crossing with a notch on a stick. The sticks are forwarded to Leopold, now promoted to regional archivist, who translates notches into numerals that feed the royal census. The census, swollen by compounded adjustments, shows Varennes as one of the most prosperous Vichy in Burgundy. On parchment, the village produces more grain than its fields can physically yield, more chickens than its coops can house, more bees than the entire forest of Orléans could sustain. The king, delighted, uses Varennes as proof that his fiscal reforms are working. He reduces the district's land tax as a reward, thereby shrinking the very revenue needed to pay the original fines. The cycle is complete. Fiction has become policy. You return during a summer so hot the river shrinks, exposing Roman paving stones last seen by legionaries 4 centuries earlier. Children play hopscotch on the stones, chanting rhymes in Latin they no longer understand. The paving blocks are smooth, worn by the footsteps of tax collectors who have come and gone so often that their sandals have polished fossilized oyster shells into mirrors. In those mirrors you glimpse the absurdity, an empire celebrating prosperity that exists only in ledgers, while the real village survives by eating the seed grain supposed to finance next year's growth. The collapse when it arrives is not dramatic. One autumn morning, the royal granary at Autumn refuses to release rye because the shipment from Varennes, recorded on parchment as delivered, has not arrived in kind. The steward, now an old man, travels to court to plead for credit. He carries with him the original willow rod with its faded knots, but the auditors laugh. Knots are not parchment. Parchment is not wax. Wax is not grain. The steward returns empty-handed. That winter the village eats its plough oxen, thereby losing the means to plant spring wheat. The shortfall is entered into the books as voluntary conversion of livestock to foodstuffs, a phrase so sanitized it conceals the sound of bones being cracked for marrow by the following: summer the king faces rebellion in Aquitaine and Saxon raids on the Channel coast. He needs revenue immediately, and the easiest source is the district that his records show as richest. A new auditor, younger, impatient, descends on Varennes with 30 mounted guards. They find bridge tolls unpaid, granaries empty, fields fallow. The auditor's report is brief. Fraud systemic, revenue zero, recommend escheat. The legal term means the crown seizes all property, turning free villagers into tenants of the royal domain. The pronouncement is read aloud in the churchyard, while the congregation stares at their shoes, ashamed of prosperity that never existed. Leopold is too old to flee. He sits in his loft, surrounded by receipts that have become toxic. Proof of guilt for numbers he never truly invented, only copied. The new auditor orders the entire archive burned to prevent further contamination. As the flames take hold, the wax seals melt first, dripping like tallow tears onto the dry parchment, which curls and flares green at the edges. The fire is so hot it warps the walnut table, shortening the longer leg until the surface lies flat for the first time in 40 years. The symmetry is perfect, useless. You watch the village revert to a state older than records. Without ploughs, the fields grow into thorn scrub. Without scrub, the sheep wander. Without sheep, the tax knot collapses into a single piece of string, good only for hanging a door. The bridge, deprived of tolls, rots again. The keeper, unpaid, becomes a ferryman charging whatever travellers can give. One day a troop of Frankish horsemen arrives looking for supplies. They find only nettles and the smell of cold ash. They ride on, leaving behind a rumour that the king has died, that the Saxons have landed, that the world has returned to its natural state of uncounted disorder. Years later, a traveller pauses to ask directions. An old woman, last survivor of the chicken-counting generation, points with a stick whose end is carved into the shape of a goose head. She speaks no Latin, only a patois of Frankish and Gothic, thickened by toothless vowels. When asked the name of the place, she replies, "Here," and when asked who rules it, she shrugs. The wind. Her hut stands where the granary once loomed. Nettles grow through the eye sockets of a broken bronze seal that once bore the profile of King Clotha. The traveller, bored by the story, leaves at dusk. In the silence that follows, you realize the kingdom did not fall because peasants cheated on chicken counts. It fell because the counts became more real than the chickens. The receipts that were supposed to guarantee order ended up devouring the substance they claimed to measure. The last sound you hear is the soft cluck of a single hen that has survived every fire, every auditor, every king. It pecks among the nettles, searching for seed that fell from sacks long since burned. Somewhere in its tiny bird brain, the memory of 32 obligations has been replaced by the simpler arithmetic of hunger and husk. The empire that once trembled at the march of armies expires in the rustle of dry weeds, and no one, not even the hen, records the moment. Before sleep, you wonder whether all civilizations end this way. Not with barbarian thunder, but with the quiet scratching of quills that outrun reality, until the day the numbers look up from the parchment and find nothing left to count. Picture the Pannonian Plain in 568, though no one calls it that yet. You stand beside a wicker cart whose wheels have sunk so deep into the spring mud that the spokes no longer revolve. They merely grate, making a sound like wet rope twisting. Around you the caravan stretches farther than boredom can travel. Women disentangling sheep fleeces, boys coaxing embers from dung chips, old men mending saddle girths with strips cut from last year's felt. The sky offers no drama, only a grey sheet, so low it brushes the horse ears. This is the Avar migration, though the people themselves use a word that means simply the wagon line ahead. They have been moving southeast for 3 weeks, fleeing. Though they would not phrase it so, the jealousy of Frankish kings and the emptiness of steppes picked clean by earlier hordes. The mud is the true sovereign here. It sucks at hoof and boot with the patience of something that remembers when this plain was sea floor. A single mare steps unwarily and vanishes to the hock. She jerks forward, snapping the leather tether that links her to the cart, and the sudden slack causes the driver, a boy of perhaps 12, to fall flat.
No one laughs. Laughter requires surplus energy, and surplus is what the mud consumes first.
The boy rises, coated in brown, wipes his eyes, and reties the tether with a knot he learned from his grandfather, who learned it from a Xiongnu captive 3 generations earlier. The knot will hold, not because it is elegant, but because it has been tested by boredom, the most thorough of instructors. You might expect these people to look barbaric, whatever that means, but the detail that strikes you is how ordinary everything appears. Their trousers are cut from Roman military blankets, the weave still visible where the dye has faded. Their horses wear bits forged in Lombard Italy, traded for sacks of dried cheese, so hard you could break a tooth.
Even the famous avar stirrup, a loop of iron that hangs from a single strap, is less impressive than you imagined.
The iron is pitted, the strap repaired so often it resembles a sedimentary layer of leather epochs. The stirrup silence is what matters. When a rider mounts, the loop accepts his foot without creak, a small courtesy that allows surprise in battle, but here merely keeps the peace in a world where every sound is swallowed by mud. Night arrives not as darkness, but as a deepening of grey. Fires refuse to catch. The dung is too wet, the wind too steady. People chew strips of raw mare's leather softened in their mouths, extracting a taste that is part salt, part smoke, part the memory of better meals. Conversation is minimal, confined to logistics. Who will stand watch? Who will scrape the horse's hooves? Who will sacrifice a felt cloak to plug the largest cart rut? The decisions are reached without counsels. They ooze into place like water finding its own level. An old woman, face cross-hatched by windburn, pours a handful of millet into a wooden bowl and adds exactly 3 drops of rendered fat. She stirs exactly 33 times, no more, no less. The ritual is meaningless except that it has been repeated every migration since her own grandmother's day, and meaninglessness repeated becomes a kind of anchor. Before sleep, the men perform another quiet ritual. They walk the perimeter feeling the ground with bare soles, testing for hidden softness that could swallow a hoof during the night. They carry no torches. Light would spoil their night vision and, more importantly, would advertise their position to whoever else might be moving across the plain. The Avars do not fear the Romans. Rome is a word for taxes you cannot see, but they fear other wagons, other knots, other languages that use the same throat sounds for hello and I take. When the circle is deemed safe, they return to their carts, wrap themselves in felt, and become indistinguishable from cargo. You lie awake, listening to the plain breathe. The mud makes a sound partway between sigh and gulp as water shifts beneath the surface. Somewhere a sheep coughs, somewhere else a horse dreams, its skin twitching against imaginary flies. The moment feels eternal, yet you know that 40 years earlier this exact patch of earth belonged to the Lombards, and 40 years before that to the Gepids, and earlier still to Hun scouts who left behind bronze buckles now repurposed as cheek pieces. Ownership is a fiction the mud tolerates, because even fiction leaves ruts, and ruts harden into roads, and roads invite the next caravan. The question that follows you towards sleep is whether the Avars are moving across the plain or whether the plain is moving beneath them, carrying them toward a destination they have not yet bothered to imagine. A decade has passed since the night you listened to the plain breathe, and the caravan has not moved more than 50 miles in any single year. They have entered what historians will later call the Avar Kaganate, though no one here uses the word state. Instead, they have discovered the strategic value of simply staying put, long enough for others to grow tired of asking them to leave. The mud has dried into cracked polygons that support grass tough enough to cut skin. Around the wagons now stand earthen ramparts no higher than a man's waist, built not by design, but by the accumulation of garbage, broken pots, animal bones, felt scraps too rotted to patch. Each spring the ramparts grow a hand's breadth. Each winter frost pries them apart. The result is a ragged ring that looks like a child's attempt at fortification, yet discourages cavalry charges because horses hesitate at the smell of their own refuse. You learn the grammar of waiting. Days begin with the same three sounds: a flint struck against iron, a horse blowing through its nostrils, a woman clearing her throat of night phlegm. After that comes the slow allocation of tasks, so routine they have become liturgy. Two girls walk to the nearest creek carrying wooden buckets whose rims are reinforced with copper hoops recycled from Roman wine barrels. They walk at the same pace every morning, adjusting automatically for the fact that the creek shifts eastward by approximately 1 sandal width per month, meandering across the plain like a drunk memorizing a boundary. By the time they return, the sun is high enough to reveal the Kagan's banner, a horsetail standard bleached the color of old bone, drooping from a pole that leans not from wind, but from the gradual settling of earth around its base. The Kagan himself is rarely seen. He lives in a wagon larger than the rest, painted with ochre spirals that imitate the tattoos once worn by his Xiongnu ancestors. When he emerges, it is usually to inspect new arrivals, Slav smiths seeking protection, Byzantine deserters carrying silk shirts that serve as currency, Frankish merchants hoping to buy horses without paying Frankish taxes. The Kagan listens without visible expression, his moustache so long it brushes the corners of his mouth, giving the impression that he tastes every word before swallowing. His decisions are delivered in monosyllables that could mean yes, no, or continue, depending on the length of pause that follows. The pause is the true vocabulary. Words are merely punctuation. One autumn, a Byzantine envoy arrives bearing gifts wrapped in the kind of purple cloth permitted only to emperors. The gifts are mundane: a golden clockwork bird that chirps when wound, a silver ewer engraved with scenes of sea nymphs. But their wrapping is the real message. By accepting imperial color, the Kagan acknowledges that he is, in some convoluted Byzantine arithmetic, a subject. He does not refuse. He does not accept. He orders the cloth cut into strips and distributed among his wives for hair ribbons. The gesture is ambiguous enough to keep both Constantinople and the Frankish court guessing, which is exactly the point. Ambiguity, maintained long enough, becomes a kind of power. Power expresses itself in small comforts. The Avars have learned to bake bread using millet flour fermented with mare's milk, producing loaves that are sour, dense, and impervious to mold. They have learned to dig storage pits lined with charcoal, keeping apples edible until midwinter. They have even learned to enjoy the sound of their own language spoken by outsiders. Slav mercenaries who mispronounce the gutturals so thoroughly that every command becomes a joke, and laughter, rare now, loosens the chest. Yet the underlying fact remains: they are still waiting. Waiting for the Franks to exhaust themselves in civil war. Waiting for Byzantine gold to outweigh Byzantine demands. Waiting for the grass to grow tall enough to hide cavalry. Waiting for something they cannot name but recognize by the itch between the shoulder blades when the wind shifts. You witness the moment when waiting crystallizes into strategy. A group of restless young riders, born during the migration, but raised in the stationary ring, propose a raid across the Danube to seize Byzantine iron. The Kagan listens, twists his moustache, and finally grants permission on condition that the raid return before the first snow. carrying no more loot than can be concealed beneath saddle blankets. The constraint seems arbitrary, but it forces the raiders to focus on quality. Small ingots, high-carbon steel, rather than bulk. They return with enough metal to reshoe every horse in the camp, plus surplus wenjen that the Kargan quietly forwards to Frankish spies, thereby reinforcing his reputation as a reliable buffer against Byzantine aggression. The maneuver is so subtle that even the raiders do not realize they have been used as diplomatic post-riders. Winter that year is the driest in memory. Snow falls once, then retreats, leaving the plain the color of old pewter. The lack of moisture shrinks the creek eastward faster than usual. The bucket carriers must walk an extra mile, their pace unchanged, their conversation reduced to commenting on the hardness of frost-bound mud. Inside the ring, the horses grow restless. Without snow to muffle sound, every snort carries, making night watch tense. Someone suggests digging a well, but the Kargan vetoes the idea. A well implies permanence, and permanence invites taxation. Instead, they melt ice scraped from the creek's frozen edges, boiling it down to a brackish concentrate that tastes of leaf rot and iron. The taste becomes normal, then preferred. One March dawn, a courier arrives from the Frankish court bearing news that King Childebert has died, leaving 3 underage sons and a regency disputed between queen mothers. The courier expects celebration.
Instead, he finds indifference.
The Kargan thanks him, offers a dish of millet bread, and asks about the weather in Metz. The courier, frustrated, hints that now would be an ideal moment for Avar intervention, perhaps to seize Pannonia outright. But the Kargan only nods and repeats his inquiry about the weather. After 3 days, the courier rides away empty-handed, unaware that his message has already achieved its purpose. The Avars now know the Franks will be busy for at least 2 campaigning seasons, which means they can wait a little longer. The section ends with a scene so muted it feels like breathing. On the first day of real spring, defined locally as the morning when the creek's ice breaks with a sound like pottery cracking, the Kargan orders the horsetail standard raised to full mast for the first time in 5 years. The tail, washed in mare's urine to keep moths away, gleams faintly in early light. Nothing else changes. The bucket carriers walk their adjusted route. The bread bakes sour. The young riders polish their new iron shoes with river sand. Yet the raising of the tail is a signal as clear as any trumpet. The waiting is almost over. The question that drifts behind your eyelids is what shape almost will take when the plain itself has grown tired of being patient. Another decade, time measured not by calendars, but by the replacement of bucket hoops and the greying of moustaches, and the Avars have become the thing they once pretended to be, a power that others negotiate around. The ring of garbage has evolved into a palisade of sharpened stakes interwoven with willow branches that leaf out each spring, giving the fortification the appearance of a hedge trying to remember it was once a wall. Inside, the population has doubled by absorption, Slav villages fleeing Frankish tithes, Byzantine deserters carrying expertise in siege engines, even a handful of Lombard widows whose dowries consist of memories how to weave narrow-sleeved tunics, fashionable in Italy. The mixture should be volatile, yet cohesion survives because everyone is united by the shared experience of waiting for something that never quite arrives. The event that breaks the stasis begins as gossip. A Lombard smith insists he can cast a bronze cauldron large enough to cook an ox whole, provided someone supplies the tin. Tin is scarce, but the Kargan's senior wife, a former Byzantine captive who still wears her hair in the elaborate braids of Constantinople, offers her last silver necklace as alloy. The cauldron is cast in a pit lined with horsehide, the cooling metal hissing like rain on hot stone. When it is lifted out, the rim wobbles. The smith declares it perfect for boiling open the gates of any city foolish enough to close them. The metaphor is crude but irresistible. Within days, every fireside conversation revolves around which city deserves such treatment. The consensus, reached without vote, is Sirmium, a Byzantine fortress downriver whose garrison has been raiding Avar pasture lands under the pretext of collecting runaway slaves. Preparations follow the same dull rhythm that has come to define Avar life. Trees are felled not in heroic sprints, but in steady daily quotas, 10 logs per day, no more, lest the axes dull beyond repair. Rope is braided from horsehair collected during spring shedding. Each strand is tested by 2 men pulling in opposite directions, the test ending only when both are bored rather than when the rope breaks. A mound of earth begins to rise opposite Sirmium's riverfront wall, but the digging is done at night to avoid Byzantine scouts, so progress is measured in handfuls. The siege, if that is what it becomes, is being built the way a snail builds its shell, incrementally, unconsciously. Summer brings the first serious rain in years. The newly dug earth turns to slurry. The mound slumps, revealing the bones of earlier camps layered like sediment. Among the bones, workers uncover a Roman milestone marking distance to a quincum. The inscription is still legible: Imp Caius M. Aurelio Antonino Pio Felice, an emperor whose name no one can pronounce. The Khagan orders the stone incorporated into the mound face outward so that the Byzantine garrison can read their own history while watching it rise against them. The gesture is so subtle it feels like courtesy rather than insult. By autumn, the mound is high enough to allow archers to shoot downward into the city, though few Avars possess bows strong enough to reach. Instead, they construct a wooden platform on which they place the giant cauldron, now filled with water and heated by a fire kept alive with sheep fat. The purpose is ostensibly cooking, but everyone understands the real aim: to force the Byzantines to imagine being boiled. The psychological effect is immediate. Sirmium's commander sends a courier offering to discuss terms, but the Khagan replies that discussions are premature. The water has not yet reached a simmer. The joke travels through the camp faster than arrows, and for the first time in living memory, you hear genuine laughter, rough as unfiltered wine. Negotiations begin in earnest when the cauldron finally bubbles. The Byzantine envoy, a eunuch whose voice carries the perpetual surprise of someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be one Jungde, offers annual tribute in gold sufficient to buy fodder for every horse in the Avar herd. The Khagan listens, twists his moustache, and counteroffers the gold is acceptable, but it must be delivered not to the camp, but to a neutral island mid-river, where neither side may erect permanent structures. The condition seems trivial until you realize it transforms tribute into ritual, a yearly performance that acknowledges Avar power without conceding territory. The eunuch agrees. Peace is signed on a wax tablet impressed with the Khagan's thumbprint. The same thumb that once tested mare's milk for readiness. The siege that never happened ends with a feast. The cauldron, finally used for its stated purpose, produces stew so copious that even the horses are allowed to drink the broth. Inside the fortress, the garrison celebrates its survival. Outside the palisade, the Avars celebrate something larger. The moment when waiting finally crystallized into leverage. Yet the celebration is muted. The young riders who once dreamed of scaling walls now find themselves responsible for collecting tribute, which means keeping records, which means hiring the Greek slave who once taught letters in exchange for butter. The circle begins to close. The barbarians, who outweighted civilization, discover that civilization enters by the same gate through which tribute exits. Years later, decades perhaps, you return to find the palisade replaced by a stockade of squared timber, the cauldron reused as a baptismal font by Slav converts. The Kargan's wagon enlarged into a hall with glass windows imported from Byzantine workshops. The horsetail standard still flies, but the tail has been replaced so many times that no strand remembers the steppe wind. The settlement has become a town whose name appears on Byzantine maps as Kaganaton, a word that sounds like a sneeze and means nothing in any language. Trade routes converge here. Coins clink. A scribe keeps records in 3 scripts. The only thing unchanged is the creek, still shifting eastward at a sandal width per month, still carrying water that tastes of leaf rot and iron. As night settles, you overhear a conversation between 2 boys. One Avar by descent, one Slav, arguing whether the cauldron was ever intended for boiling oxen or for boiling gates. Neither knows the answer and neither cares. The argument is merely a way to pass the time while waiting for the next caravan. You realize then that the Avars did not conquer the plain. They taught it to wait with them. The siege that wasn't has become a parable whose moral is patience itself, and the parable will outlast the stones of Sirmium, the milestones of Rome, even the horsetail standard. The question you carry into sleep is whether any power can survive once its greatest weapon is the willingness to outlast the very story that created it. The year is 643, the location a square stone room built into the seaward wall of Ravenna's harbour. Officially, it is the illustrious Dux's office of
lighthouses and pilot dues, but everyone calls it the
lantern office because its single window faces the lantern tower whose fire guides ships through the tidal flats. The room is so small that when you extend both arms, your fingertips graze opposite walls. Yet within this compression, the Empire maintains a border more intricate than any wall of stone. The clerk in charge, a man named Probos, born in Pisidia, educated in Constantinople, posted here as punishment for misplacing a decimal in the Cappadocian grain levy, sits at a desk whose surface is scarred by generations of wax seals scraped hot onto parchment. His job is to translate reality into numerals and numerals into reality. How many barrels of Istrian wine may land before customs? How many Syrian sailors may step ashore without paying the heathen surcharge? How many Lombard brides may enter the city without a dowry tax? You arrive at dawn, when Probos lights the first oil lamp. The wick is braided from 3 strands of flax, soaked in olive oil, cut with a 1/10 part of fish sauce. The mixture burns with a faint smell of anchovy and sanctity, a combination Ravenna has come to associate with imperial authority. Probos trims the wick using a bronze scissors shaped like a dolphin, a tool so specific it exists nowhere else in the empire. The first document he opens is a request from a Lombard widow named Gundiperga, who seeks permission to remarry a Greek merchant currently resident in the city. The request is routine. Remarriage permits generate a solidus and a half in fees, but attached is a slip of parchment proving that Gundiperga's first husband died fighting in service of the res publica, a phrase so vague it could mean anything from soldiering to tax collection. Probos's task is to determine whether the widow qualifies for the military widow's exemption, which halves the fee. The problem is conceptual. How do you verify service in an empire that no longer keeps central rosters? Provincial commanders send fragmentary reports, but these are filed by year, not by name, and the years are catalogued according to indictions. 15-year cycles whose numbers repeat, so that year 12 could mean 612 or 627 or 642. Probos spends the morning climbing a ladder to reach the highest shelf, where dusty tubes contain musty lists of barbarian foederati employed during the reign of Heraclius. The lists are written in 2 hands, the original Latin now overwritten with Greek marginalia that sometimes contradict the primary text. He finds no Gundiperga, but he does discover a Gundulphus, who served in the garrison of Classe, the port suburb. The names are close enough to suggest a relation, close enough to justify approval if Probos chooses charity, close enough to deny if he chooses rigor. Charity wins, not because Probos is kind, but because rigor requires paperwork he does not possess. He drafts the permit in the mandated triplicate, one copy for the widow, one for the groom, one for the Imperial Archive that will never be read. The ink is mixed with a drop of lamp oil, so it will dry glossy, signifying authenticity. While the ink sets, he warms his hands over the flame, noticing that the window facing the lantern tower is aligned so precisely that on equinox mornings the sunrise light strikes the desktop, illuminating the exact spot where the imperial seal must be placed. The architect who designed the harbour wall died 2 centuries ago, yet his geometry still dictates the choreography of bureaucratic sunrise. At midday, a ship arrives from North Africa carrying wheat stained red by desert dust. The captain presents a bill of lading that lists the cargo as wheat, sound, 600 modi, but Probos's clerk, a boy with one lazy eye, measures the sacks and finds only 580 modi. The discrepancy is small, 20 modi, roughly enough to feed 50 people for a month, but the principle is large. If Probus accepts the false bill, he becomes complicit in fraud. If he rejects it, he delays a hungry city and risks riot. He chooses compromise. He records 590 modi, thereby sharing the loss between crown and captain, and imposes a fine of 1 solidus payable to the Harbour Improvement Fund, a line item that exists only in his ledger. The captain pays gladly, considering the bribe cheap, and both men leave satisfied that the empire still functions, even if its arithmetic wobbles. Afternoon brings a more delicate case. A group of Syrian monks seek exemption from the landing tax on the grounds that they carry relics of St. Sergius, whose intercession once saved Ravenna from Lombard siege. The relics, housed in a walnut box the size of a child's hand, are accompanied by a parchment sealed with the Patriarch of Antioch's bulla, the wax green with age. Probos has seen counterfeit bulls before. The easiest test is to sniff the seal. Genuine imperial wax smells of pine, forgery of tallow. The box passes the sniff test, but Probos notices that the parchment's fibers run vertically, whereas Antiochian parchment runs horizontal. The inconsistency is tiny, visible only to a man who has spent years aligning fibers so that ink does not feather. He denies the exemption, not because he doubts the relics, but because the forgery offends his aesthetic. The monks accept the ruling with equanimity, suggesting that their spiritual cargo is valuable enough to merit honest tax. They pay, then ask for directions to the church of San Vitale. Probos provides them, along with a recommendation for a baker who sells communion bread at wholesale rates. Dusk approaches. Probos trims the lamp again, this time cutting the wick shorter to conserve oil. The harbour master has warned that the next shipment from Istria is delayed by pirates. In the dimming light, he opens his final case, a personal letter addressed to himself. The sender is his sister in Constantinople, who writes that their mother has died, that the funeral was small because the family could not afford the burial tax. That Probos's share of the expense is 12 nomismata, roughly equivalent to 4 months of his salary. The letter is written in a careful hand that tries to disguise grief beneath accounts: cost of shroud, cost of grave niche, cost of the priest who refused to read the full psalter unless paid up front. Probos reads the letter twice, then places it beneath the limestone slab that also waits the day's permits. He will answer tomorrow. Tonight, he must balance his books, and grief is a liability that does not convert easily into numerals. As darkness completes its occupation of the room, he performs the last ritual. He extinguishes the lamp not by blowing, but by lowering a brass cap that starves the flame of oxygen. The method prevents smoke from staining the ceiling, thereby reducing the frequency with which the room must be whitewashed, a saving recorded in microscopic numerals at the margin of the annual budget. The cap closes with a soft clink, the sound of imperial order sealing another day. Before sleep, you consider the paradox. The lantern office governs a border that exists only on parchment, yet every ship that enters the harbour must pass through its rectangle of lamplight, every marriage, every sack of wheat. The border is not where the empire ends. It is where the empire agrees to be confused with itself. The question that follows you into darkness is whether Probos's smallest decision, to approve Gundeperga's fee, to split the wheat loss, to deny the monks, will one day tilt the balance when the Lombards finally march, or when the emperor stops sending oil, or when the lantern itself goes dark for want of anchovy sauce. Gundeperga's wedding takes place on an overcast morning that smells of seaweed and incense. She wears a tunic of Lombard cut, narrow sleeves, braided hems, but the fabric is Syrian silk, a gift from her Greek groom, whose name is Alexandros and whose trade is scent. He imports rose attar from Damascus, stores it in tiny glass amphorae stoppered with wax, and sells it to Ravenna's matrons, who daub it behind ears, still ringing with church Latin. The marriage is performed in the chapel of San Michele, a stone barn whose mosaics depict angels wearing armor that looks suspiciously like Ava Lamella. The priest, eager for the modest fee, rushes through the vows. Gundeperga responds in a voice steady enough to suggest practice, though she has never before spoken Greek. After the ceremony, the couple returns to the lantern office to register the change in tax status. Probos greets them with the formality owed to a woman whose exemption he approved on circumstantial evidence. He notes that Alexandros lists his profession as merchant of odors, a category not covered by existing tariffs. After a moment's hesitation, he creates a new line item. Aromatics, luxury, levied at 1 tremissis per ounce. The rate is arbitrary, but it establishes precedent, and precedent is the only inheritance a bureaucrat can bequeath. Alexandros pays without protest, then asks whether the same form might serve for future shipments. Probos agrees, stamping the parchment with a seal whose dolphin emblem has begun to wear smooth from overuse. The next weeks reveal the unintended consequences of approval. Gundeperga, now fluent in 2 languages and comfortable in neither, becomes a conduit between Lombard enclave and Greek quarter. She translates prices, mediates disputes, and, almost accidentally, begins keeping her own ledger recording who owes what to whom. The ledger is written on the back of old permits, the reverse side blank, because Probos's pen runs dry before he reaches the bottom margin. In her hands, these blanks become a private economy, a pound of silk for 2 ounces of attar, a promise of harbour access for a discount on funeral spices. None of it is illegal exactly, but it exists outside the imperial mesh, and anything outside eventually presses against the weave. One afternoon she arrives at the lantern office carrying a small ivory box. Inside lies a scrap of parchment covered in a script. Probos does not recognize, later identified as Hebrew, accompanied by a Greek translation attesting that the fragment is part of a bill of lading for 30 casks of cinnamon.
Origin unknown. The box is a gift, Gundeperga explains.
From a merchant who hopes to avoid the new aromatics tax by reclassifying cinnamon as medicinal. Probos refuses the bribe, but his refusal is gentle. He has begun to enjoy the widow's visits, her quiet competence, her scent of rose and wool. Instead of reporting the incident, he files the box under miscellaneous curios, a category so vague it swallows objects without trace. Winter tightens. The next shipment of lamp oil is delayed by storms. Probos must ration light, trimming the wicks so severely that the flame resembles a nervous pupil. In the dimness, he miscopies a permit, transposing the numerals in a cargo of African red slipware. The error is small, 120 dishes become 210, but it creates a surplus on parchment that must be balanced by an equivalent deficit somewhere else. He corrects the mistake by adjusting a future shipment of Thracian honey, thereby borrowing against a revenue that may never arrive. The maneuver is standard. Every clerk keeps a private ledger of future adjustments, a sort of bureaucratic purgatory where errors wait to be born into truth. Gundiperga discovers the error inadvertently when Alexandros's next cargo, this time of frankincense, is impounded because the honey deficit has triggered a general suspension of Thracian imports. She confronts Probos not with accusation but with arithmetic. If 120 dishes are taxed at one rate and 210 at another, the difference could finance a week's worth of lamp oil, enough to prevent the miscopying that caused the problem in the first place. Her solution is elegant. She offers to buy the surplus dishes at the lower tax rate, then sell them privately at market price, using the profit to restore the honey credit. Probos objects on principle. Gundiperga counters that principle without oil is darkness. Compromise is reached. She will conduct the transaction under his supervision, splitting the profit evenly. The royal share recorded as voluntary contribution to lighthouse maintenance, a line item so noble no auditor will question it. The deal succeeds beyond expectation. Ravenna's elite, eager for African ware that bypasses official channels, pay a premium. The honey credit is restored. The lamp burns brighter. Probos finds himself invited to dinner at Alexandros's house, a modest apartment above the Rose Attar storeroom where the air is thick enough to taste. Over spiced wine, he learns that Gundiperga is pregnant, that the child will be raised bilingual, that its first word will likely be prophet, though whether in Greek or Lombard is undecided. The evening ends with a gift, a tiny glass vial containing a single drop of attar mixed with olive oil, the mixture calibrated to burn for exactly 1 hour, the length of time Probos needs to copy a standard permit. The gift is personal yet practical, affectionate yet transactional. Like everything else in the lantern office, spring brings the equinox sunrise, the moment when light strikes the desktop at the precise angle required for sealing. Probus performs the ritual automatically, then notices that the dolphin scissors have begun to tarnish. He polishes them with the same cloth used to shine the imperial seal, and in the reflection he sees himself, older, thinner, eyes ringed by the perpetual half-light of paperwork. Behind him stands Gundiperga, quietly entering the day's transactions into her own ledger, her script neater than his because she has not yet unlearned the care of youth. The image is so symmetrical it feels like a closing of accounts, though the books remain open. The section ends with a detail almost too pretty to be true. On the last day of the fiscal year, Probus discovers that the aromatics tax, invented arbitrarily for Alexandros, has generated exactly 12 nomismata, the same amount his sister requested for their mother's funeral. The symmetry is coincidence, but coincidence is the only sign the bureaucracy recognizes as divine. He seals the surplus into a small pouch and sends it to Constantinople via the next imperial courier, marking the entry as maternal debt repaid. The act is meaningless in the scale of imperial finance, yet it closes a circle that began with a widow's exemption and ends with a drop of rose oil burning for 1 measured hour. The question that lingers is whether any circle truly closes, or whether the seal merely presses the ends together long enough for the next clerk to cut them apart. The coup, though no one calls it that until later, begins with a routine audit. The new prefect, a Sicilian named Euphemios, arrives armed with instructions from Constantinople to eliminate provincial leakage, a term vague enough to indict anyone. His first act is to order a complete relisting of every permit issued since the last indiction. The task is impossible. The archives occupy 3 rooms above the harbour gate, their files layered like sediment, earliest documents written on parchment so brittle it cracks at a whisper. Probus, now senior enough to delegate, assigns the job to his lazy-eyed clerk, who copies frantically, inventing missing entries to conceal gaps created by mice, mould, and the occasional spilled cup of wine. The invented entries are plausible. Probus has trained the boy well, but they multiply until the copy becomes fatter than the original, a literary obesity that offends Euphemios's sense of order. Order is restored by fire. One July night, the archive room ignites, supposedly from a lamp overturned by rats. The blaze is contained before it spreads to the harbour, but the oldest records vanish, including the original permit for Gundeperga's marriage and the fire that swallowed the archives, including the original permit for Gundeperga's marriage and the first aromatics tax ruling. Probos stands in the corridor while embers drift about him like lazy fireflies. He feels neither panic nor sorrow, only the dull recognition that a bureaucrat's memory has been externalized for so long that its destruction feels more like amnesia than tragedy. Euphemios, silhouetted against the orange, issues an order. Every surviving document must be recopied within 30 days, the cost to be borne by the local administration. The command is impossible. The staff consists of probos, the lazy-eyed clerk, and a boy who sharpens quills, but impossibility is merely another entry in the ledger, to be solved by adjusting future revenue. Gundeperga arrives at first light, having heard the bell that warns of harbour mishap. She finds Probos scraping wet ash from a half-charged sheet, the marriage permit, its seal curled like a dead leaf. The parchment is still legible if one squints, but legibility is no defense against an auditor who has decided that fire is proof of guilt. She offers to transcribe what she remembers, her memory being the inverse of parchment, growing clearer with use, and Probos, too tired to object, accepts. They set up a temporary desk on a wine barrel in the customs shed. The shed smells of tar and raisins. Gulls walk the rafters, their droppings adding random diacritics to the copies. For 10 days they work at the edge of lamplight, recreating permits from memory, inventing marginalia to replace what was lost, signing each other's names with practiced flourishes. The lazy-eyed clerk contributes by forging the seal impressions. He carves a new dolphin scissors into a potato, stamps it in warm wax, and the result is crude but convincing enough for a harassed courier who changes horses every 15 miles and has no time for aesthetics. By the end of the fortnight, they have produced archive that is fuller, neater, and more internally consistent than the one that burned. Euphemios accepts it with a sigh that might be satisfaction or merely heartburn. He departs, taking with him a chest of newly copied documents and leaving behind a warning that the next inspection will be unannounced. Life resumes its tidal rhythm. Alexandros' rosatar sells well that summer. The profit allows Gundeperga to purchase a small house near the lantern office, close enough that the smell of fish oil lamps seeps into her dreams. Their child is born at equinox, a girl with eyes the colour of wet parchment. They name her Lucia, after the martyr whose feast coincides with the harbour lantern's annual refuelling. Probos becomes a reluctant godfather, offering as gift a miniature dolphin scissors carved from the same bronze that once trimmed imperial wicks. The gesture is sentimental in a way that makes him uncomfortable. He records the cost as maintenance of archival goodwill, and the entry balances. Yet equilibrium is temporary. The following spring, the emperor issues an edict reorganizing the entire Western bureaucracy. Local customs are to be centralized under a single logothete stationed in Syracuse, all receipts henceforth written on purple-dyed parchment supplied by the imperial dye works. The change is announced in language so ornate it obscures the practical consequence. Every permit Probos has reissued is now invalid unless recopied onto purple stock. The purple parchment arrives in rolls so stiff they could serve as roof tiles. The ink required is silver, not black, and must be purchased at private expense. Probos calculates the cost, 12 nomismata for materials alone, the precise amount he sent to his sister the previous year. The symmetry is insulting. Gundeperga proposes a solution as elegant as it is tedious. They will continue to issue white permits for daily use, keeping a parallel set of purple copies locked away for inspection. The dual system doubles the workload but preserves the harbour's flow. Captains who cannot read Greek will never notice the colour difference, and Euphemios, if he returns, will see only neat purple stacks smelling of fresh wealth. Probos objects on moral grounds. Fraud is still fraud, even when painted imperial purple. But morality is a luxury ill-affording by a man whose room is literally crumbling. The harbour wall has developed a crack that admits a fingernail of sunlight at dawn,
widening each week.
He capitulates, and the copying begins again, this time by lamplight filtered through purple vellum, giving faces the bruised look of people who have stared too long at sovereignty. The duplicity breeds its own etiquette. Captains accept their white permits with a bow that acknowledges unspoken compromise. Probos stamps purple copies with a seal whose dolphin is now so worn it resembles a leaping fish, a species no one can name. Lucia grows up believing that paperwork naturally arrives in twinned colours, like eyes or hands. She learns to walk, holding a scrap of purple, sucking the corner, until the dye stains her saliva. Gundeperga, anxious about poisoning, substitutes white rags. Lucia rejects them, preferring the taste of empire. The anecdote is recounted at dinner parties as evidence of innate civic virtue, though it reveals more about the displacement of taste by colour. Autumn brings the inevitable reckoning. A courier arrives bearing news that the purple dye works have exhausted its murex banks. Future shipments will be diluted with indigo, producing a blue-purple distinguishable to the trained eye. The logothete in Syracuse demands samples of current stock for comparison. Probos realizes that his hoard of true purple will mark his permits as either privileged or fraudulent, depending on the viewer's mood. He weighs the alternatives: burn the purple and claim short supply, or accelerate issuance before inspection. Burning is safer but wastes capital. Acceleration risks exposure. He chooses a third path. He will use the purple for permits that are already obsolete, thereby creating a layer of archival decay that future auditors will dismiss as natural attrition. The strategy is so arcane, it feels honest. The night before the courier's return, Probus dreams of the equinox sunrise. In the dream, the light strikes the desktop as always, but the seal has become transparent, the dolphin swimming free through parchment that ripples like water. He wakes with the solution. He will substitute thin wafers of horn for purple sheets, carving the seal into surface so shallow it can be read only by oblique light. Horn is cheaper, durable, and, most importantly, flammable without leaving ash that differs from parchment. He spends the remaining hours cutting and polishing, the shavings curling like the script he once copied. When dawn arrives, the harbour lantern is extinguished for cleaning. In its absence, he burns the purple stock, the flames tinged purple blue, the smell acrid and regal. The courier accepts the horn permits without comment. Perhaps he has been bribed. Perhaps he is illiterate. Perhaps the Empire no longer cares about colour so long as the numerals add. Probos feels neither triumph nor relief, only the familiar hollowness that follows the balancing of books. He returns to his narrow room, trims the lamp to its lowest sustainable flame, and begins drafting next year's permits on plain parchment, white as the eye of a fish. The work proceeds in silence, broken only by the distant clang of the harbour buoy, a sound that marks the entrance to Ravenna, and by extension to the empire itself. Years compress into decades. Lucia learns to read Greek and Latin, to calculate modii and solidi, to trim a wick so precisely that the flame neither gutters nor smokes. She replaces the lazy-eyed clerk when he dies of a cough that tastes of ink. Alexandros grows wealthy, then poor, then wealthy again as fashion shifts from rose to jasmine. Gundeperga's hair silver until it matches the dolphin scissors. The crack in the wall widens enough to admit a cat. which becomes the office's unofficial archivist, sleeping on warm piles of permits and giving birth to kittens whose eyes are the same bruised purple as the obsolete parchment. No one remembers the original color of imperial dye. Purple becomes a story told to children, like saints who carry their own heads. The end arrives not with invasion, but with abbreviation. A messenger from Syracuse announces that the Western logothete has been abolished. Ravenna's customs will henceforth remit revenue directly to Constantinople through a single annual shipment. No permits required, only a sealed summary. The Lantern office is to be closed, its staff pensioned at half salary, its archives, what remains, transferred to the Patriarchal Library, where they will moulder under ecclesiastical indifference. Probos receives the news while copying a permit for a cargo of Sardinian cheese. He finishes the line, dots the I, blots the page, and only then sets down his pen. The gesture is final in a way that burning had not been. Completion is a kind of death. On the last day, he and Lucia burn what cannot be transported. Obsolete white permits, forged purple copies, horn wafers that curl like leaves. The fire is small, economical, almost domestic. Gundiperga brings honey cakes. Alexandros pours wine cut with water. The cat purrs around their ankles. They speak of mundane things, the price of lamp oil, the smell of seaweed, the way gulls now nest in the extinguished lantern tower. As if the empire were a neighbor who has moved away without leaving a forwarding address. When the ashes cool, Probo scoops them into a jar, labels it miscellaneous, unsorted, and places it on the highest shelf of the now empty archive. The jar will remain there long after the room is repurposed as a storeroom for fishing nets. A reminder that every border eventually dissolves into dust, fine enough to slip through the cracks of history. You walk out with him at dusk. The harbour lantern is dark for the first time in living memory. Ships navigate by starlight and the memory of fires that no longer burn. Probos carries only the dolphin scissors, now reduced to a stub of bronze warm from his palm. He offers it to Lucia, who declines. She has learned to measure by eye and no longer needs the crutch of metal. The scissors pass instead to a boatswain who uses it to send frayed rope, thereby entering the tool into a new genealogy of utility far from imperial ledgers. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rings the hour incorrectly. No one corrects it, because correctness belongs to an office that no longer exists. Before sleep takes you, Probos stops at the edge of the tidal flats, bends, and writes his name in the wet sand. The letters last only until the next wave, which erases them with the same indifference it shows to milestones, mooring posts, or the footprints of ex-bureaucrats. He straightens, brushes sand from his knees, and remarks, more to the wind than to you, that an empire is nothing more than the sum of all the hours spent keeping its contradictions legible. The wave returns, smoothing the beach into a page awaiting the next permit that will never be issued. The light from the darkened lantern tower is replaced by moonlight, which requires no oil, no trimming, no seal, and, most importantly, no excuse. The question you carry into the final sleep is whether the barbarians ever needed to invade, or whether they had already entered through the crack in the wall. The space between white permit and purple copy. The pause between the extinguishing of one lamp and the lighting of the next. History will record that Ravenna fell to Lombard arms centuries later, but the fall you have witnessed is quieter. The moment when paperwork recognizes its own redundancy and steps aside, leaving only the smell of anchovy sauce and the sound of pages turning themselves in a breeze that owes nothing to empire.